The American Reformation was a significant period in American history between 1820 and 1860, spurred partially on by the Industrial Revolution and westward expansion. To what extent did the American Reformation movements reflect both positively and negatively on American society? Three significant movements of the American Reformation period were the expansion of the public education system and the groups capable of receiving education, the women's rights movements, both in economic rights and jobs and their civil and social rights, and temperance, and the mediation and sometimes banning of alcohol. The question of whether the American Reformations had a positive or negative reflection on society has everything to do with industrialism. Industrialism between 1820 and 1860 was the greatest influence on the American Reformations, as well as a major cause of them, and had both negative and positive effects. Between 1825 and 1850, industrialization brought about the possibility of expanding the public education system for the children of unskilled laborers in factories in the North, thus making the idea popular in New England, where industrialization was a common occurrence, and rather than the South. However, the way in which the government expanded the public education system was poor and disorganized. The school teachers had little skill and little to no salary, and the schools only ever taught the basic skills of reading, writing, and arithmetic, and were only open for a few months out of the entire year, in comparison to the better private schooling. The only reformers of the disorganization of the expanded public education were William H. McGuffey, who wrote textbooks that expanded on the basic skills of reading, writing, and arithmetic, and Horace Mann, who vied for better schools, higher wages, more variety in the schooling. All in all, industrialization had both positive and negative effects on America's public education system between 1825 and 1850. While it did help to create the Reformation itself and expand the system, there was also little or no campaign to improve the quality of education until Horace Mann. Industrialization also caused an increase in the movement for women's rights. It began with an increase in the need for unskilled labor, and factories, especially textile factories, started to hire women because they worked for less pay and they were considered to be more obedient. However, this ultimately led to the women's rights movement. While industrialization did cause women to be able to get work beyond being housewives or midwives, the mass consumerism also forced them to work under 12 to 13 hours of work for very small wages compared to those of men, and the monotony of working in a textile factory under unskilled labor. One of the first mills to rely on women as employees was in Lowell, Massachusetts. It paid higher wages to women than any other factory in the area and boarded them at the factory under relatively pleasant conditions. However, as conditions worsened, they formed the Lowell Female Reform Association of 1844, showing the education of women in the era. In fact, the increased education of women during the American Reformation period was another effect of industrialization, because women had access to libraries and lecturers. One of the first colleges to allow women was Oberlin College in 1837, although there was still a lack of coeducation. One of Oberlin's graduating classes in 1855 shows not only the positive but also the negative results of the women's rights movement. Women were able to attain a secondary education and graduate college. However, they were still not able to be co-educated with men and receive equal education. A direct result of the increased secondary education of women, the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848 addressed women's lack of civil and social rights, such as suffrage and representation in the legislature. They created the Declaration of Sentiments under Elizabeth Cady Stanton as a model based on the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Sentiments was the written product of the Seneca Falls Convention, based even in its writing on the Declaration of Independence. It addressed such rights as marriage inequality, the lack of legislative representation, and the lack of suffrage, and the unequal property rights. However, the document was ignored politically, having been penned by women. Ultimately, industrialization was a major cause of the women's rights movement. It allowed them to participate in the economy, educate themselves, and go on to vie for their civil and social rights. However, society did not grant those rights, and the Declaration of Sentiments was ignored. Women received bad wages and poor working conditions, despite their participation. The Industrial Revolution and economic reform also brought about such movements as the temperance movement. The industrial age was the age of efficiency and speed, and alcohol decreased efficiency. Drunk employees at factories caused economic problems, commotions, and forced the factories to lose their revenue. As a result, the American Temperance Society was formed in 1826 in Boston, Massachusetts. Taking the temperance pledge became common practice. However, the Maine Law in 1851 was a complete ban on the making and selling of alcohol and reflected American extremism, followed by other prohibition laws, all in northern states. Industrialization led to an address of a supposed American alcohol problem, and thus was a positive reflection on American society because it reflected the values of temperance and mediation in the era of consumerism. However, American extremism was also prominent in prohibition laws in the northern states like Maine. Industrialization led to major reformations in the fields of education, women's rights, and alcoholic temperance. However, these reformations only reflect positively on society and their creation and ideological intentions. They were poorly carried out, and they reflect the American inability in the 1800s to see their ideas through to the end. Major sources were the American Pageant U.S. History textbook by David M. Kennedy, Elizabeth Cohen, and Thomas A. Bailey. Additionally, the Lords and the Mill Girls article by Mari Klein, and Google Images for the plentiful images of people and factories.